A nurse was hired to care for a millionaire in a vegetative state. Everything seemed normal until one day, when no one was looking, something happened that left her in complete shock. Richard Brown woke up that morning with the confidence of someone who had repeated the same ritual dozens of times, flying his private jet to attend a business meeting and returning by nightfall with new contracts signed. Before leaving, he meticulously reviewed a set of documents he planned to sign upon his return. They were crucial papers for the future of his foundation, that philanthropic project that had become his greatest pride. The phone rang, and with a sigh he answered in a firm voice. "Mary, my daughter, do you have everything in order?" he asked with warmth and a slight sense of urgency. "Yes, Dad," she replied. "Are you sure you want to make these changes so soon?" "More than sure. I need you to review the Foundation's files and keep everything under control. When I get back, we'll address the remaining details." After hanging up, Richard headed to the private runway with his team. That day, the sky seemed painted in a flawless shade of blue. There wasn't a cloud in sight, and the cool breeze hinted at a smooth flight. Yet sometimes, the worst accidents happen on the clearest days. The jet took off smoothly, having passed all the necessary checks. A few minutes later, the panoramic view of the city became a distant tapestry. Everything seemed in order, until suddenly, a strange noise shattered the cabin's calm. At first, it was merely a faint vibration, almost imperceptible. However, within seconds, it transformed into a chilling roar that reverberated through the entire fuselage. "What's going on?" asked one of the crew members nervously. "I'll check the indicators," Richard responded, trying to maintain his usual composure. "Stay calm." But the indicators began flickering erratically, as though some invisible force were interfering with them. The pilot started maneuvering for an emergency landing, while the metallic noise grew louder with every jolt. "We have an engine failure!" shouted the co-pilot. The plane lost altitude abruptly, and in the blink of an eye, the situation shifted from a minor setback to a genuine emergency. Panic seized everyone on board. The smell of fuel and the screech of metal heralded a catastrophic outcome. With labored breathing, Richard clung to his seat and cast one final look of both courage and concern at his companions. "Let's try to land," he managed to say in a trembling voice, without finishing the sentence. Amid the chaos, the aircraft shook violently, as if it were a delicate paper model caught in a fierce wind. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, although for the passengers, time seemed frozen, stretching into an endless instant. Shouts, sparks, and a muffled crash preceded a deafening roar. The impact with the ground was brutal. The metal twisted with a harrowing screech. Among scraps of luggage and dense smoke, Richard lay there, too weak to move, trapped in that limbo between life and death. He felt faint pulses in his heart, just enough to keep him barely conscious, yet not strong enough to fend off the darkness looming over him. No one escaped unscathed from that accident. The cries of the injured and the wailing alarms faded into the distance. As the rescue teams made their way through the debris, Richard Brown's fate was sealed in that terrified silence, in that disconnection that would later turn him into a motionless figure teetering on the edge of an abyss. 6 months before the chaos that was about to erupt at the Brown mansion, everything changed in the blink of an eye. That flight, which was supposed to be routine, ended up snatching Richard away from his ordinary life and leaving him in a disturbing vegetative state from which no one could assure his return. 6 months after the accident that left Richard Brown at death's door, the Brown mansion existed in almost perpetual gloom. The curtains remained drawn, admitting only the faintest slivers of light from grey afternoons that seemed to stretch on forever. The household staff, once accustomed to the hustle of parties and charity events, now moved with exquisite care, as if any step might disturb the house's fragile hush. That day, Caroline Johnson, a nurse specialized in neurology, stepped through the mansion's towering front door with the resolve born of experience, yet also the humility of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. At 29, she already had a brief but intense track record in caring for neurological patients. However, none of her past encounters prepared her for the somber atmosphere that filled the Brown residence. "Welcome, Miss Johnson. I'm Sophia Guzman, the housekeeper," said a woman with a serene face and a tired voice, greeting her courteously. "Thank you for coming." Caroline introduced herself with a slight nod. She quickly noticed the dark circles under Sophia's eyes and the signs of constant worry in her hands, which bore the marks of hard work and unrelenting anxiety. "I'll show you to Mr. Brown's room," Sophia continued, starting down a carpeted hallway. The family portraits on the walls seemed to watch the newcomer with a blend of curiosity and melancholy. As they advanced, Caroline sensed the heavy hush broken only by their echoing steps. She felt the quick glances of staff from behind half-open doors in dimly lit corridors. It was as if everyone in the mansion were holding their breath. Upon reaching a pair of wooden double doors, Sophia paused, drew a deep breath, and opened them carefully. Richard's room had once been bright and spacious, but now the drawn curtains and the constant hum of life support machines gave it a somber, secluded air. There lay Richard Brown, the magnate who, before the accident, used to fill newspaper columns with his projects and philanthropy. Now he remained motionless, confined to a vegetative state from which few doctors believed he would awaken. Caroline approached the bed with great care. She took in every detail: the respirator, the monitors, the lines tracing his vital signs. A shiver ran down her spine, bringing back searing memories. Her father in a hospital bed, struggling between life and death, and she, powerless, praying for a miracle that never came. At that moment, Caroline understood the responsibility she had just taken on. It wasn't merely another job. It was a chance to provide what she hadn't been able to give her father when he needed it most. She remained silent for a moment, gauging the strength of her own commitment. Then she took Richard's limp hand and, in almost a whisper, spoke words of introduction and hope. "Mr. Brown, I'm Caroline. I've come to help you, and I won't give up." For Sophia, for the household staff, and very soon for Caroline herself, these words would be more than just a statement. They would be a promise of a new beginning, a breath of faith in the midst of the gloom threatening to swallow everything. The morning spread a diffuse grey over the Brown mansion, mirroring an atmosphere laden with uncertainty. Mary Brown waited in what used to be her father's office, poring over endless balance sheets and strategic notes. Since Richard fell into a vegetative state, she had not only lost her father, but also found herself shouldering the weight of managing the family business. The sound of discreet footsteps in the hallway announced Caroline Johnson's arrival. Opening the door, Mary regarded the nurse with weary eyes, but also a hint of gratitude. "Thank you for coming to see me so early," Mary said with a sigh, inviting her in. Caroline immediately noticed the tension on the young woman's face, the same anxiety she had sensed in the mansion's staff. There was a palpable worry in the air, one that couldn't be explained solely by Richard's condition. Something else loomed like a dark cloud over the family. "I wanted to introduce myself properly," the nurse responded. "I specialize in neurology, and I want you to trust my work. I know these circumstances are difficult, but I'll do everything I can to help Mr. Brown." Mary offered her a seat beside the large window, now only half curtained, allowing a faint light to filter in. "I can't deny it's somewhat of a relief to have extra help. But I have to be honest, I don't want to get my hopes up. Dr. Santa Maria has made it clear there have been no changes in my father's condition." She paused, as if afraid to say the word vegetative out loud. Caroline nodded in understanding. She had heard those arguments in other similar cases and knew how draining it was for families to keep hope alive day after day. Mary let her gaze drift over the documents covering the desk. "I need to make big decisions. My father's foundation is in a sort of financial limbo. Every day, Camilla Sosa, who oversees the Brown Foundation, reminds me of ongoing social projects, orphans, student scholarships, aid programs. They all need immediate support, Yet the company's partners also demand drastic measures to avert bankruptcy. She closed her eyes for a moment, and her shoulders slumped slightly. And as if that weren't enough, some of my relatives have turned into a ravenous pack. A few want to invest in new ventures, others want to cut costs. And there's always someone insinuating that keeping my father like this only prolongs needless suffering. Caroline could feel the emotional burden crushing Mary. She felt compelled to offer words of comfort, but held back. She didn't know the young woman well enough to know if she wanted to unburden herself or keep things private. Ultimately, she chose a firm yet empathetic tone. "I know it's not easy. I'll work closely with Dr. Santamaria, and I'll do everything in my power to improve your father's condition, even if it's just through small steps. In my experience, sometimes the tiniest signals can open doors no one imagined." Mary listened carefully, although her expression revealed that hope was a luxury she found hard to indulge in. "I hope you're right. If there's any way for my father to wake up, to get his life back." She let the sentence trail off, as if she were afraid to speak her deepest wishes aloud. That night, as Caroline left the office, the mansion was still cloaked in a solemn hush. Yet behind Mary's closed door, a storm of tensions was brewing, the foundation hanging by a financial thread, anxious business partners demanding immediate results, and relatives with murky interests circling like vultures. Walking down the hallway, Caroline realized she wouldn't just be caring for a comatose man. She had also plunged into a world where every decision could shape the fate of many people. The steady hum of machinery in Richard's room was a constant reminder of life's fragility, while the pressure of finances and family swirling around the Browns loomed like a storm about to break. That evening, she fell asleep with her mind fixed on Mary, burdened by an overwhelming weight, and on Richard, a man who might still carry within him the will to reclaim what fate had interrupted. The lights in Mr. Brown's room were kept low to avoid disturbing his delicate condition. Since Caroline's arrival, the room, once oppressive with the droning of machines, had taken on a different atmosphere, steeped in silent yet persistent optimism. Day after day, she began her shift by approaching the bed, checking monitors, and adjusting medications as needed. Then, with a remarkable naturalness, she spoke to Richard in hushed tones, as if he could answer her. "Good morning, Mr. Brown. It's a bit cloudy today, but the temperature's nice," she would whisper, carefully straightening the sheets and making sure the pillows were positioned comfortably. "Maybe we should put on some music to brighten this place, don't you think?" Caroline started sharing stories of her own daily life, little anecdotes that might seem trivial to others, but for her were a way to build a bridge to Richard's sleeping mind. She also played soft songs, ballads, and classical pieces that gently resonated in the room. And though she sometimes felt exhausted, she never stopped addressing him in a warm, cordial tone. It happened during one of those late-night shifts, when stillness was broken only by the steady rhythm of the monitors, that Caroline thought she saw something unusual. The fingers of Richard's left hand moved slightly. At first, she assumed it was a common reflex, a mere spasm. However, she approached with her heart pounding in her throat and called out his name clearly. "Mr. Brown, can you hear me? It's Caroline." She repeated her name several times, and to her amazement, noticed a faint trembling in that hand, almost imperceptible, as though the patient wanted to acknowledge her presence. Shaken and trembling with excitement, she grabbed her notebook and wrote down the exact time and details of the movement. She spent the rest of the night on alert, watching every inch of Richard's hand, waiting for any further sign of response. At daybreak, she went straight to Dr. Thomas to share the good news. She found him in the adjoining room, going over some medical reports. "Doctor, I noticed movement in Mr. Richard's left-hand fingers last night. I think," she explained eagerly, showing him her notes. "He seemed to react when I spoke directly to him. Though polite, the neurologist's expression showed a hint of doubt. He ran a hand over the bridge of his nose and sighed. Caroline, I don't want to discourage you, but patients in vegetative states often exhibit involuntary reflexes. These spasms can coincide with external stimuli, though they don't necessarily indicate regaining consciousness. His words didn't dull the light in the young nurse's eyes. She sensed, with that sixth sense born of empathy and dedication, that these subtle movements were more than mere reflexes. "I understand, Doctor," she answered calmly, "but I don't want to ignore the possibility. I'd like to continue recording everything and keep a detailed log. If it keeps happening, maybe we can do more in-depth tests." He nodded without much argument, though his gaze stayed skeptical. "Certainly. Keep a detailed record of everything you observe, and we'll evaluate it together later on." Caroline returned to Richard's room, hugging her notebook to her chest, a tumult of emotions washing over her, from pure hope to the fear of being mistaken. She didn't want to indulge in false optimism, but she couldn't deny that she'd felt a living presence in that faint tremor, in that hand that almost seemed to cling to the thread of life. Resuming her usual routine, she played a soft tune she remembered was one of Richard's favorites from his days as a philanthropic businessman. She promised herself she wouldn't give up. If a feeble movement of the fingers could mean something, no matter how small, she would be there to document it, celebrate it, and fight to foster it. In that resolve, Caroline found one more reason to stand firm, keeping alive the flame of hope that, with a bit of faith, might bring Richard Brown back from the silence that currently held him. The days at the Brown mansion passed under a perpetual sense of anticipation. As Mary struggled to reconcile her desire to honor her father's ideals with the family's financial realities, tensions only continued to mount. In the large meeting room, a long, dark wood table gathered Camilla Sosa, representative of the Brown Foundation, Kevin Brown, Richard's brother, and other legal and financial advisors to the family. Mary presided over the session with a somber expression. "Here are the documents that support the urgency of continued funding," Camilla said, placing a dossier on the table. The folders contained reports of orphanages on the brink of closure and educational projects in vulnerable areas that depended on the Foundation's contributions. Mary took the papers and skimmed the figures and requests. The thought of cutting funds that could be vital to hundreds of children weighed on her. Yet her mind, trained by months of forced responsibilities, nudged her to remember the family business's precarious economy. "These kinds of programs were my father's passion. He would never have let them fail," she remarked, a note of melancholy creeping into her voice. From the far end of the table, Kevin Brown let out an impatient sigh before speaking. "I don't doubt my brother's good intentions, Mary, but are you really willing to drive the company into bankruptcy just to keep up the foundation?" His tone was incredulous, almost mocking. "In any case, the wise thing is to turn off the tap for a while. This isn't the moment for philanthropic luxuries." Camilla frowned at Kevin's coldness. "If you've read the reports, you know these are not luxuries, Mr. Brown. These are children, young people, entire communities depending on our resources to survive. Your brother understood better than anyone the importance of social work." "My brother is in a vegetative state," Kevin retorted, his voice low but sharp. "He can't have an opinion or make decisions. As much as we might want otherwise, reality needs to be faced. And the reality, Mary, is that you can't sustain everything: the company, the foundation, and also a patient who shows no signs of recovery." His words rang out like an uncomfortable echo in the room, and Mary felt a lump rise in her throat. She knew Kevin wasn't just referring to the medical expenses required by Richard's condition. There was a darker motive behind his urgency to sell shares and cut budgets. "I won't let you question my father's dignity or the Foundation's importance again," Mary answered, trying to remain composed. "But I understand we can't just stand still. I promise I'll look for a financially viable solution." Camilla nodded with a hint of relief, though unease still hovered in the air. Kevin shrugged, barely hiding his annoyance. "Fine, but each passing day, the debt grows. Don't expect me to sit here watching the ship go down. We're at our limit, Mary." The meeting ended in a tense atmosphere. Camilla gathered her things and left politely, while Kevin stomped out, his folder tucked under his arm and a grim look on his face. Alone in the room, Mary remained, gazing at the portrait of her father on the wall and recalling his presence, strong, optimistic, always ready with a word of encouragement for those around him. That night, the mansion's heavy silence melded with Mary's persistent thoughts. Should she let the foundation die or risk financial ruin? Should she heed her father's voice in her memory or follow Kevin's pragmatic advice? Should she hold out hope that Richard might awaken or accept that perhaps he would never open his eyes again? Meanwhile, in the patriarch's room, Caroline spoke to him with her trademark warmth, sharing details of the day, of the shy sunlight that peeked through, and of the children who would benefit from the foundation if it managed to survive. Despite the hardships, every word and gesture made clear that, at least for her, compassion and perseverance were not on the line. They were, rather, the spark that kept hope's flame alive. A heavy air enveloped the Brown mansion, family tensions, financial worries, and the persistent echo of a father on the brink of death. Yet amid these shadows, someone moved with a different purpose. Daniel Rivas, a private detective with a discreet manner but an incisive gaze, made his way into the Browns' world without much fuss. His presence, however, carried in its pocket the seed of truth. Hired in secret by Mary, Rivas set out to piece together a puzzle whose first piece was the plane crash that had changed the family's fate. The young woman was convinced it had not been a simple mechanical failure. Too many unanswered questions hovered for it to be chalked up to mere bad luck. The detective pored over records and maintenance logs for the jet, reviewing every detail meticulously. He examined flight logs, technical reports, even receipts for spare parts. Any scrap of information could confirm his suspicions. Among his inquiries, Daniel interviewed several mechanics at the hangar where the plane was kept. One of them recalled seeing, days before the flight, a man with the surname Brown in the restricted area. It wasn't Richard. The testimony was vague, but enough to spark the detective's alarm bells. Who else in the family had both access to and motivation for tampering with that aircraft? The notion that the accident hadn't been a random stroke of misfortune grew stronger when Sofia Guzman, the housekeeper who had served Richard for decades, shared a revealing piece of information. She mentioned a change in the will that her employer was planning to finalize right before that fateful flight. Sofia never knew the exact content of the new document, but she did know Richard was anxious to sign it as soon as possible, as if he feared time was running out. Mr. Brown was in a hurry, Mr. Rivas, and those papers disappeared after the accident, Sofia said, her voice trembling at the memory of the last day she saw her employer at the mansion. Daniel grasped the significance of those words immediately. A missing new will. A man named Brown lurking around the plane. Every clue pointed in the same direction, a conspiracy larger than Mary had ever imagined. If someone was desperate to seize the fortune or prevent the will's revision, sabotage would have been the perfect way to carry out their plan. That day, leaving the mansion, Daniel vowed to uncover the truth at any cost. With the missing document as his new target, each step brought him closer to the hidden arteries of a family drama whose repercussions endangered Richard's life and that of anyone who stood in the way of his inheritance. Caroline was in the mansion's break room, reviewing a new set of medical reports on Richard's condition. In recent days, she had increased the range of stimuli she used in hopes of detecting some new sign of consciousness in him. She was examining motor response graphs when she heard determined footsteps in the hallway. Looking up, her face lit up, if only for an instant, upon recognizing her older brother, Jacob Johnson. "What are you doing here?" she asked, blending surprise with a touch of wariness. "Sis, I wasn't going to sit idle while half the city whispers about potential intrigue in the Brown family," he replied, entering with a firm stride. Jacob was a journalist, well known for his drive to expose scandalous plots. He barely took a seat before leaning toward the table, scanning the documents Caroline was holding, without asking permission. So, how true are these rumors about sabotage on the plane? Caroline exhaled defensively. She valued her brother's passion for the truth, but she also knew the risks of exposing any such conjecture when everything was so delicate. "They're only rumors for now," she said carefully. "All I know is that some people are investigating, people who believe it wasn't an ordinary accident. But please, Jacob, don't publish anything yet. A media scandal could worsen the tensions here. And above all, it could hurt Mr. Richards' recovery." "Since when do you care so much about the press?" he shot back with a hint of irony. He knew how protective Caroline had become of her patient. "I get the feeling there's more behind your plea for caution. Has anyone threatened you? Are you scared of repercussions?" Caroline shook her head and fixed her gaze on the papers, as if trying to dodge her brother's piercing questions. "It's not that. It's just that Mr. Brown already has enough on his plate just trying to survive each day. I don't want to pile on unnecessary pressure or see his tragedy turned into a sensational headline." Jacob softened when he recognized the sincerity in his sister's voice. There was genuine concern, both professional and personal. After a weighted pause, he left, promising to handle any information he released with care, though he made it clear he wouldn't stop searching for answers. That night, as the lights dimmed throughout the mansion, Caroline was left alone with her memories. She closed her eyes and recalled the last time she had seen her father conscious. She had been sitting at the edge of his hospital bed, clutching his hand in the desperation of someone clinging to a final hope. Her father, victim of a sudden stroke, gazed back at her with a mix of tenderness and sorrow, unable to say the word he most longed to speak, be it "thank you" or "I love you." The helplessness of those days came back to her like a cold wind. She had always blamed herself for not being able to save him, for lacking the resources to fight against the death that took him so suddenly. The memory pained her, yet it also gave her the strength to devote herself to her profession with an almost stubborn passion. She felt that by caring for Richard Brown, she was making peace with life itself. "I won't watch anyone die again without fighting with all my might," she whispered to herself, gently stroking Richard's motionless hand. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep hope alive." With that promise, Caroline stayed by his bedside through the night, aware that on the other side of the mansion walls, her brother Jacob was digging into the darker corners of the accident, and that sooner or later the truth would come out. Yet in her heart, the most important thing was preventing the tragedy from repeating itself, this time with a man who could still cling to life. A dim light enveloped Richard's room when Caroline entered, holding a portable music player in her hands. That evening, she decided to try something different: music therapy. She recalled her specialized nursing studies, where she had learned about the positive effects music could have on patients with neurological disorders. Although Dr. Santamaria was not entirely convinced, she felt it was worth a shot. Carefully, she placed the headphones over Richard's ears and started playing a recording of classical music. At first, nothing altered the usual hum of the monitors, but as the piece progressed and reached its more intense passages, Caroline noticed a subtle change in his cardiac readings. It was as if each musical crescendo triggered a slight uptick in Richard's heart activity. Intrigued, she ran the test again. This time, she left her phone recording both the sound of the monitor and Richard's reaction. Once more, the climaxes in the melody seemed to coincide with small variations in his vital signs. Caroline's intuition grew stronger. Perhaps, deep within the silence surrounding Richard, there was still some spark of awareness. That same night, with the video and charts fresh in her mind, Caroline called Julius, her fiancé and a medical resident. They quickly started a video call, and she shared her screen to show him the data and recordings. "Look, it happens right when the music hits its highest point," she explained, fast-forwarding the video to the precise instant where the monitor's curve visibly changed. "Don't you think it could be a sign of an auditory response?" Julius, always methodical, adjusted his glasses and studied every detail on the screen. "It's possible. I've read studies about responses to sound stimuli in patients with minimal consciousness. We can't jump to conclusions yet, but it is an encouraging sign. The next day, Caroline gathered her courage and showed her findings to Dr. Santamaria. He received the information with interest, though he couldn't hide a veil of skepticism. "Miss Johnson, I appreciate your dedication, but we need more comprehensive clinical studies before making any announcements," he said, tapping his portfolio. "We shouldn't confuse involuntary responses with true signs of consciousness." Despite the doctor's caution, Caroline felt deep in her heart that Richard wasn't completely disconnected from reality. She recalled the slight movement of his fingers and now his response to the music. To her, each small sign was reason enough to keep trying. With renewed determination, she began to plan more music therapy sessions, sensory stimulation, and meticulous record-keeping. Meanwhile, the melody of hope kept echoing in that room, reminding her that even in the darkest situations, sometimes all it takes is a pulse, a gesture, or a few bars of music to light up the possibility of a new awakening. Day after day, the shadow of uncertainty spread over the Brown mansion. While medical concerns remained at the forefront, legal and financial issues began seeping into every corner of the family's conversations. Kevin Brown, Richard's brother, and Eleanor Diaz, his sister-in-law, grew increasingly impatient, almost as though they couldn't find a moment's peace until the fate of that multi-million-dollar inheritance was settled. "Mary, what news is there about the medical assessments? Haven't the doctors suggested disconnecting him yet?" Kevin asked one morning, his tone cool and insistent. Mary, her face drawn from weariness and sorrow, struggled to maintain her composure. "There's no reason at all to disconnect my father, Kevin. As long as there's the slightest chance he might respond to treatment, I'm not even considering that idea," she replied, her voice trembling with a hint of indignation. Nearby, Elena Diaz sipped her tea in silence, eyeing her sister-in-law with a carefully measured show of sympathy. "We all want what's best for Richard," she ventured, choosing her words with caution. "But we also know how costly it is to maintain this level of care. Have you thought about the financial strain it puts on the company and the family?" Mary couldn't stifle a gesture of exasperation. She knew that behind the facade of concern lay impatience and a hunger to access the fortune which, according to the existing will, still the only one legally recognized, might fall to Kevin and, by extension, Eleanor. "I've thought about it all, believe me, and my answer is still the same. I won't do anything against my father's wishes. As long as there's the slightest chance he could come out of that state, I'll do whatever it takes to keep him going." The tension in the air was palpable, nearly as heavy as the thick velvet curtains covering the salon windows. Camila Sosa, the Foundation's representative, did what she could to mediate. In private, she reminded Mary how important it was to keep the social projects alive. Once again, she emphasized that if Richard died without signing the changes to his will, everything would fall under traditional rules, in other words, into Kevin and Elena's hands. An outcome that, she feared, could end the philanthropic dreams Richard had worked so hard to foster. "The Foundation depends on that amendment," Camilla confided in a whisper, catching Mary in one of the hallways. "If the current will remains the only valid one, Kevin and Elena could dismantle everything without a second thought." Mary nodded, her gaze drifting down to the tiled floor. She needed to protect not only her father's life, but also the legacy he had built with so much care. At the same time, she had to keep the company's finances in balance. Every day, the pressure mounted, and the atmosphere grew ever more suffocating. In the other wing of the mansion, Caroline went on with her stimulation sessions for Richard, oblivious to the schemes and ambitions boiling away behind office doors. Even so, she wasn't entirely immune to the suspicion and calculated hostility in the air. Sometimes she crossed paths with Kevin or Elena in the hallways, and their looks made it clear that, to them, the mere fact she kept trying to bring Richard back was a nuisance to their plans. Still, Mary stayed firm. Though the emotional toll weighed heavily on her, she clung to the hope that her father wasn't completely lost in his vegetative state. Any sign she witnessed, from minute movements to the fluctuations Caroline recorded, served as a small beam of light against the darkness of greed and despair threatening to devour everything. In this climate of disputes and hidden agendas, a silent battle for control of the inheritance was taking shape. And as the pressure mounted, furtive glances and whispered words in the corridors became part of the sad symphony echoing through the great brown house, a prelude to events that, sooner rather than later, would test loyalties, emotions, and the family's true strength. The tension inside the Brown mansion intensified by the day, yet alongside the growing unease, a shared resolve emerged to uncover the truth. Daniel Rivas had started to pinpoint the common thread that could expose Kevin's hidden intentions. That very day, the detective confirmed his worst fears. Kevin was saddled with massive debts and, more unsettling still, had negotiated insurance policies that would significantly boost his income if Richard died. Meanwhile, Jacob Johnson used his contacts in the journalistic world to dig into the Browns' bank and notarial records. He discovered references to loans Kevin had taken out on the premise that, sooner or later, his brother's inheritance would pull him back from the brink of bankruptcy. Though not yet conclusive proof, this documentation clearly indicated a pressing motive to speed up whatever outcome might seal Richard's fate. When Mary learned of these findings, she was gripped by a mix of anger and anguish. Until then, she had clung to the belief that her uncle couldn't possibly be capable of such depravity. Now, however, reality forced its way in. She had to act fast to protect her father from any desperate moves. Her determination at a breaking point, she met secretly with Daniel Rivas, Jacob, and Camila Sosa to devise a plan that would keep Kevin from pushing his agenda further. All the while, Caroline pressed on with Richard's sensory stimulation exercises. Each day, she tried new approaches, recorded slight reactions, and noted every fluctuation in the monitors. Deep down, she sensed that helping Richard recover wasn't just a matter of medical willpower, but also a race against time. Every minute that passed gave Kevin more leeway to carry out his dark ambitions. Thus, little by little, a covert team formed within the mansion, united by a single goal: to uncover the truth behind the plane crash and protect the legacy Richard had so painstakingly built. Each person held a different piece of the puzzle, hoping that once they all fit together, they would save not only Richard's life, but also the future of the Brown Foundation and everyone who still believed in justice. The tension at the Brown mansion had reached a suffocating peak. The corridors, once filled with laughter and cordial conversations, had turned into pathways of suspicious glances and silences laden with reproach. Kevin, aware that the investigation was pointing in his direction, began to feel cornered. Each day, Daniel Rivas and Jacob Johnson found new evidence of his involvement in what appeared to be a sabotage of Richard's plane. Desperate, Kevin turned to his closest ally, Elena Diaz, Richard's sister-in-law, who was just as eager as he was to claim the inheritance. Together, they devised a plan that, in their eyes, was the quickest way to free themselves from the economic and emotional burden of an unconscious Richard. They decided to go before a medical committee and present arguments insisting on the irreversibility of Richard's condition. They would invoke both pity and logic, alleging that keeping him alive only prolonged unnecessary suffering. "We have to look sincere and grief-stricken," Kevin told Elena in a low voice. "If we can convince them that there's no chance of recovery, they'll authorize the disconnection, and then this ordeal will finally end." While that sinister strategy was taking shape, on the other side of the mansion, Mary and Camilla were combing through Richard's personal library. They were searching for any clue that might strengthen the Foundation's legal protection when they stumbled upon a draft of a will hidden among some old folders. Upon reading it, they discovered that Richard intended to allocate an even larger percentage of his assets to the Foundation. This document was a direct blow to the interests of Kevin and Elena, as it would drastically reduce the portion of the inheritance they could claim. Feeling their hearts pound, both women understood the immense power that draft would carry if it became official. This discovery raised the stakes in the impending confrontation. In upcoming family meetings, Kevin and Elena would face off against Mary and Camilla, each side armed with evidence and arguments, some seeking to tighten their grip on the fortune, others determined to preserve the philanthropic legacy and, above all, protect Richard's life. Everyone knew the moment of truth was drawing near, and that the fate of the unconscious magnate would soon be decided by the medical committee and ultimately the law. The atmosphere at the Brown mansion grew heavier with each new step Kevin and Elena took toward the outcome they so desperately wanted. Yet Mary and her allies understood they couldn't afford to remain on the defensive. With support from Camilla, Daniel Rivas, and Jacob Johnson, the time had come to act and lay bare the truth. In the midst of this silent crusade, Caroline and Julius took the risky step of conducting more rigorous tests on Richard. They knew that the smallest evidence of motor or cognitive activity could tear down any claim of irreversibility that Kevin intended to present to the medical committee. Thus, using specialized stimulation devices, they projected repetitive flashes of light near Richard's eyes, carefully arranging them in well-defined sequences and patterns. At first, the changes on the monitors seemed random. However, after several attempts, both Caroline and Julius noticed faint shifts in his brain activity that followed the same rhythm as the stimuli. It was a subtle finding, but extraordinarily significant. If confirmed by third parties, it would be the best evidence that a spark of consciousness still flickered within Richard. "Look, here on the EEG readout," Julius pointed out, indicating a curve that rose slightly each time the light flashed brighter. "This sequence doesn't seem like mere coincidence." Caroline nodded, her enthusiasm held in check. Immediately, she took a photo of the screen, recorded a video, and wrote down precise notes on every fluctuation. She would guard this evidence with utmost care, ready to share it with any specialist who could validate her observations. Meanwhile, in another area of the mansion, Mary, Daniel Rivas, and Jacob Johnson met discreetly in Richard's old study. Each brought their own weapons, reports proving the plane's sabotage, financial records that revealed Kevin's enormous debt and suspicious insurance policies, and the draft of the will reinforcing Richard's intention to protect the foundation. "We have to bring all this forward before the next family meeting," Mary stated, her eyes shining with determination. "If we wait, they might get ahead of us by requesting the disconnection and, who knows, force an irreversible outcome." Daniel Rivas, keeping his investigators cool, organized the documents into a well-labeled folder. "I'll make backup copies and talk to some contacts in the police force. They need to know Richard's life is in danger and that our evidence points directly to Kevin." Jacob, for his part, pledged to go further using his network of trusted journalists. It wasn't about creating a scandal, but rather establishing a protective media layer in case Kevin tried to take desperate action. A sense of urgency pulsed among them all. They understood that more than the Brown family fortune was at stake. Richard's life and the legacy he wanted to leave the world were also on the line. In the hallways, the silence still felt grave, yet a new force was taking shape. A group united by truth, determined to prevent greed and betrayal from triumphing. If Richard managed to show any sign of consciousness in front of witnesses, Kevin and Elena's plans would collapse. And that night, as Caroline observed the patient's subtle responses, she understood that hope was not mere fantasy. It pulsed within each of them, waiting for the right moment to prove that life still found a way to push through any adversity. Night fell on the Brown mansion, veiled in a deceptive stillness. The wind scarcely stirred the garden's branches, and the silence seemed to drape everything beneath an impossibly thick cloak. Yet the moon, pale and high in the sky, seemed to foretell an event that would abruptly shatter that calm. And so it did. Moving quietly, Kevin slipped into the basement area where the home's fuses and backup electrical systems were located. To avoid suspicion, he chose a little-known passageway, once used for storing gardening tools. Despite the darkness of the route, he advanced with the sure footing of someone who's ready to do whatever it takes to get what he wants. Elena, his accomplice and Richard's sister-in-law, remained a few steps behind, keeping an ear out in the corridors, ready to warn him if anyone noticed his intentions. "Hurry up," Elena whispered, barely breathing. "Don't worry, this won't take long," Kevin murmured coldly as he opened the control panel. With trembling hands, he began unplugging cables and adjusting the fuses. One by one, the power indicators went dark. In a matter of seconds, a crackling spark ran through the panel, and every light in the mansion vanished, as if a thunderclap had ripped through the stillness of the night. A shrill beep instantly rang out in Richard's room. Caroline, reviewing a recent report of her observations, jumped up. She realized at once that Richard's ventilator and monitors were losing power. Her eyes widened in contained panic as the mechanical alarm blared to life. "Mary!" she shouted, running into the hallway, heart pounding. Sophia, the housekeeper, got there first. "The lights are out across the whole house. Something must be wrong with the electrical system." In the half-darkness, Mary and Julius came racing from the far end of the corridor. Julius carried a small flashlight, barely illuminating their anxious faces. "We have to switch on the emergency generator," Mary said resolutely, unwilling to waste even a moment. Meanwhile, Caroline returned to Richard's room. The ventilator hissed in an increasingly erratic rhythm, and his heart rate began to plummet dangerously. Without hesitation, Caroline started manual support measures, trying to maintain oxygen flow as the rest rushed off to activate the generator. "Hold on, Mr. Brown," she whispered, sweating and with her own pulse pounding. "I'm not going to let this end here." At the far end of the corridor, Kevin and Elena hid behind a half-open door, holding their breath. They had planned the blackout perfectly, so it would look like a mere accident, a technical failure that, with a bit of bad luck, could prove fatal for Richard. They hadn't expected that, in a matter of seconds, the house would fill with activity and everyone would rush to Mary and Caroline's aid. The emergency generator finally roared to life. The lights flickered for a few seconds before stabilizing, and the ventilator whirred back into action, restoring the vital support Richard so desperately needed. Exhausted, Caroline felt the weight of the entire world on her shoulders, yet she refused to leave until she was certain his cardiac rhythm had regained stability. Realizing their plan had failed, Kevin slammed his fist against the wall in frustration while Elena bit her lip, struggling to hide her own fury. It was obvious now that their mutual suspicions wouldn't absolve them if anyone managed to piece everything together. In Richard's room, Mary let out a long breath of relief when she saw her father was still alive. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead. Julius leaned in to check his vitals, confirming that for the moment, the patient was holding on. Caroline, hands trembling, felt a silent gratitude for the determination of everyone who had run to help. That night, the Brown mansion filled with terrified whispers and the same question in every glance. What really happened to make the electrical system fail so suspiciously? The power outage exposed the extent of Kevin's desperation to close the gap between him and the inheritance, and, at the same time, showed the unbreakable resolve of those determined to protect Richard, no matter how many shadows threatened to devour it all. The night remained tense throughout the mansion after the sudden power failure that nearly ended Richard's life. Everyone's breathing was unsteady, as though the very house, its walls steeped in history, was holding its breath, waiting for the imminent revelation of long-kept secrets. In the midst of the chaos, while Mary rushed to ensure her father's condition was stabilized, Daniel Rivas raced down the hallways, determined to find Kevin and demand answers. Turning a poorly lit corner, Daniel spotted him. Kevin was trying to slip out through a side door, the one leading to a service area and then beyond the property's grounds. At the sight of Daniel, Kevin started and pretended he was just looking for an exit to get some air. The detective, however, blocked his path with conviction. "You're not going anywhere, Kevin. Enough lies." His voice echoed through the hallway, rattling the nerves of the man before him. Cornered, Kevin clenched his fists, debating whether to offer yet another excuse or make a run for it. In the end, desperation won out over reason. With a rough move, he tried shoving Daniel aside. What followed was a brief scuffle, hands flailing, bodies shoving, ending with the detective applying a simple hold that pinned Kevin against the wall. The thump of his back against the cold marble reverberated in the endless hush of the night. "Let go of me, damn it!" Kevin shouted, voice cracking. "Not until you tell me the truth," Daniel responded, barely breaking a sweat from the effort. Panic drove Kevin to blurt out part of his secret. Between curses and half-choked sobs, he started letting slip incoherent phrases that suddenly made terrible sense. "Yes, it was me. I tampered with the plane, but I didn't do it alone," he babbled. "Elena knew too. There was no other way. I was up to my neck in debt. I had no choice." His words struck the hallways like a detonation. Before Daniel could dig deeper, Elena Diaz suddenly appeared at the far end of the corridor, her face tense. She had followed Kevin at a cautious distance, but when she realized everything was falling apart, the pretense of loyalty crumbled in the face of her own fear of going to prison. She took a few hesitant steps toward where they struggled, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender. "Stop it, Kevin!" she exclaimed, voice trembling. "You can't drag me into this any more than you already have. I only helped because you said we'd work something out to save the family." Her eyes flicked from Daniel to Kevin in agitation. "If it's prison or telling the truth, I'm sorry, Kevin. I won't take the fall alone." At that instant, the scene froze with the sound of sirens in the distance, approaching quickly. Acting on Mary's instructions, she had called the police the moment Richard's monitors started failing suspiciously. Several patrol cars burst through the mansion's main gate. When the officers came down the corridor, they found Daniel firmly restraining Kevin, who was still struggling wildly, and Elena standing there, babbling a half-confession that left no doubt about her complicity. "Arrest them!" barked the lieutenant in charge, after Daniel Rivas gave him a concise rundown of what had happened. Within minutes, the police had both Kevin and Elena in handcuffs, unable to concoct any further excuses. Kevin's face was contorted with anger and defeat, while Elena refused to stop pleading for leniency in her case. Everything, the plane crash, the power outage, the debts, the rush to see Richard dead so they could collect the inheritance, came tumbling out with each word from her trembling lips. On the ground floor, Camilla and Jacob looked on as the officers hauled away the conspirators. Their expressions mixed indignation over such a heinous betrayal with profound relief that the truth had finally emerged. Sophia, the housekeeper, clung to Camilla's arm to keep from fainting, horrified that the Brown family had been pulled into such depths of greed and violence. Meanwhile, in Richard's room, Caroline and Julius kept working to fully restore the patient's life support. Thanks to the emergency generator and both of their skilled efforts, the machines regained functionality. The steady beep marking his heartbeat evened out, and the ventilator once again synced with Richard's fragile lungs. The scare had been tremendous, but the man continued clinging to life with fierce determination. "Mr. Brown, we did it," Caroline whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "We won't let them take you away from us. Not while there's still hope." Julius gently squeezed his fiancée's shoulder, sharing the same blend of weariness and relief. The long night of conspiracies and exposures left behind, amid the darkness, a light as powerful as it was unexpected. The truth had finally surfaced, along with the promise that Richard could keep fighting for his recovery, now free of the traitors lurking in the shadows. Gradually, the footsteps and voices echoing through the mansion faded, until silence reigned once more. But this time, that silence no longer carried menace. It announced a new chapter in the Brown story, one in which justice stood triumphant, and Richard's life, like a steadfast beacon in the night, held out for the hope so many had assumed lost. Dawn crept through the Brown mansion's windows in a soft glow. Barely a night had passed since Kevin and Elena's conspiracy had finally come to light, but the sensation that everything had changed was undeniable. The police stationed outside had led the traitors away in handcuffs, and though the atmosphere was still fraught with tension, it brimmed now with a renewed sense of hope. In the main sitting room, Mary listened intently as Dr. Santamaria reviewed the reports on the tests conducted by Caroline and Julius. Faced with new EEG readings and recorded footage, Santamaria had no choice but to concede that Richard showed a pattern consistent with minimal consciousness. The signs were slight, but they indicated there was something to rescue, some active link in the magnate's mind. "We'll move on to more advanced therapies," Santamaria concluded, turning to Mary. "It's going to be a long road, but there are definitely medical grounds for optimism. For now, any talk of disconnecting him is off the table." His words were a balm to Mary's heart. For weeks, she had endured the fear of losing her father for good and the constant threat of the conspiracy looming over him. Now, with Kevin and Elena in custody, and confirmation that Richard might not be as lost to unconsciousness as many feared, she felt a rush of resolve to protect him more fiercely than ever. At that moment, Camilla arrived, beaming with relief and excitement. She held in her hands the draft of Richard's will they had found in his personal library. Without delay, the two of them headed to the family's legal office, where they took the necessary steps to finalize the document. In it, Richard had made clear his desire to allocate more funds to the Brown Foundation, ensuring its continuity and expanding the scope of its charitable programs. "We can complete the paperwork right away, Miss Mary," the attorney confirmed, sealing the documents with his stamp. "This guarantees the foundation will receive what your father intended. And with Kevin and Elena under investigation, there's no doubt this will stands." Hearing the news, Camilla almost broke down in tears. For weeks, she had feared that all of Richard's philanthropic work would be forgotten or torn apart by other family members' dark agendas. That final signature became the pillar supporting the foundation and, in a way, the benevolent legacy Richard had upheld all his life. Meanwhile, working in coordination with Mary and with Caroline's approval, Jacob Johnson wrote a detailed article for his media outlet. He laid out the conspiracy that caused the plane crash and the attempt to disconnect Richard. The story came to light under a headline that, while avoiding sensationalism, sought to expose the truth. "The Magnate Who Chose to Live: How the Brown Family Faced Betrayal." Caroline's name resonated as that of the tireless nurse who had raced against time to keep the businessman alive. Dawn was almost breaking when, after a seemingly endless day of revelations, arrests, and legal procedures, Caroline made her way to Richard's room. Early morning light slipped through the partially open window, illuminating the patient's tranquil face. She approached quietly, her heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her ears. Gently, she took Richard's hand and leaned in to speak in a soft voice. "Mr. Brown," she whispered, "we did it. The truth came out, and soon you'll be getting the therapies you need. I'll be here to help you take every step in your recovery. I won't give up. I promise." As she uttered these words, she sensed something different, a subtle flutter, barely perceptible beneath Richard's eyelids. Her breath caught, and she glanced at the monitors to see if it was merely a reflex. The machine kept a steady pace, but she detected a faint change in the EEG, a slight fluctuation coinciding with that moment when Richard seemed to respond. Then she felt a gentle squeeze of her fingers, a tiny gesture, but unmistakable enough to make her chest fill with emotion. A trembling hope shone in her eyes, and she leaned forward again to murmur, "Welcome back. I've been waiting." That brief spark of contact, fleeting as a glimmer of light, marked the start of a new dawn for the Brown family. Beyond the betrayals and the danger, the possibility of a recovery, long and arduous though it might be, now presented a clearer horizon. The silence in the room was no longer a symbol of uncertainty, but rather the prelude to a different story, one in which faith, perseverance, and compassion began their march to rescue Richard from the jaws of tragedy and guide him toward the light he so deserved. The story of Richard Brown and those around him reminds us how fragile life can be, and how the greatest battles are often fought in the quiet of a hospital room. Every character has crossed a threshold of uncertainty, confronting fears, ambitions, and values face to face. On one side, we witness the greed and treachery of Kevin and Elena, representing the darkest side of family ties, where an unbridled drive to seize a fortune ultimately reveals a hollow claim, since its true owner continued to battle between life and death. Their conspiracy shows us how moral boundaries can blur to the point of vanishing when the goal is to hoard power or money, leading to such terrible actions as sabotaging a plane or trying to hasten the death of someone once dear. At the same time, we see Mary and Caroline's unwavering devotion and love. Each embodies loyalty and hope in a distinct way. Mary, as a daughter, never stops believing her father might awaken, carrying on her shoulders a colossal burden, safeguarding the business, protecting the foundation, and grappling with family scheming. Caroline, for her part, offers her nursing vocation to sustain that fragile thread keeping Richard alive. Through her professionalism, empathy, and determination, she proves that true strength lies not only in medical skill, but also in the emotional bond forged with the patient. The Brown Foundation serves as another key element, revealing Richard's noble spirit. Even in his unconscious state, his legacy resonates powerfully. The support for orphanages and educational projects underscores the enduring impact of human solidarity. The foundation becomes a source of conflict because it lays bare the clash between the ideals of a charitable enterprise and the economic interests certain individuals insist on protecting or exploiting. Moreover, the combined efforts of Daniel Rivas, the detective, and Jacob Johnson, the journalist, underline the importance of pursuing the truth. Each from his own trenches, they strive to uncover the conspiracy that threatened Richard's life. Their discoveries not only expose Kevin and Elena's insidious motives, but also demonstrate how justice can flourish when backed by courage and solid proof. Perhaps the most profound message of this story resides in the fragile boundary between life and death, and how even a faint blink or a light squeeze of someone's hand can herald a new beginning. Through music therapy sessions, physiological responses, and small motor reactions, the narrative emphasizes the importance of never losing faith in those who, despite remaining silent, may be waging their own inner battle to return to consciousness. Taken as a whole, this saga teaches us that perseverance in the face of adversity can surpass any wall of betrayal, greed, or medical pessimism. A simple refusal to give up, to refuse abandoning someone still in a coma, is a way of upholding the dignity of human life. It is a reminder that as long as there is a hint of hope, there is reason to fight, to persist, and to believe in the light that can emerge even from the darkest corners. Ultimately, the story of a nurse caring for a millionaire in a vegetative state, amid secrets and family intrigue, highlights how love, loyalty, and truth can triumph over the most destructive ambitions. It reminds us that sometimes the smallest gestures, a flicker of eyelids, a clasp of hands, or minimal signs of awareness, can serve as heralds of a new dawn. And that brings us to the end of our thrilling tale about the nurse and the millionaire in a vegetative state. I hope this story, brimming with unexpected twists, betrayals, and most of all hope, has captivated you as much as it did me while telling it. Remember, just like Caroline, we must never underestimate the power of determination and empathy, even in the darkest circumstances. If you enjoyed this story, give us a like and subscribe so you won't miss the next ones. And of course, let us know in the comments what you thought of the ending and what you took away from this incredible narrative. We'll see you again very soon with more stories that remind us of the value of life and the power of truth. Until next time.